Just consider the course of events if their action were to proceed to trial. If they won, it would mean the police were guilty of perjury, that they were guilty of violence and threats, that the confessions were involuntary, and that the convictions were erroneous. That would be such an appalling vista that every sensible person would say it cannot be right that these actions should go any further.
The British judges in relation to Northern Ireland have been a part of the British establishment or the British war machine, whatever you want to call it. They had no interest in justice. Their main interest was in preserving the reputation and standing of the British establishment, the British armed forces, the British police force.
In the 1980s, campaign groups calling for the men's release spread across the UK. The MP Jeremy Corbyn was one of a number of politicians who pressured the then Home Secretary to refer the Six's case back to the Court of Appeal.
We were able to give what I believe to be very convincing arguments as to why, at the very least, there should be a retrial or re-examination of the evidence. And books were written, television films were made, campaigns were mounted, marches and demonstrations were held. But initially, some of them were very small. I remember going to Worthing one night for a public meeting in support of the Birmingham Six, and there were 4 of us on the platform and 3 in the audience. On other occasions it was like that. It was only much later on that it became such a popular issue, and I do remember going to very large meetings.
Their second appeal started at the end of 1987. It was heard by Lord Chief Justice Lane.
We had 23 witnesses at the 87th appeal, and they were all Crown witnesses. Police officers, prison officers, ex-police officers. And the judge turned around and said they were either all liars or else they were just too unbelievably believed. And he dismissed the whole case, knocked every one of them out. And they sent us back. But of course, by that time, we had got credibility from all around the world. There was campaigns in practically every city in the UK, universities. Southampton University was the first one to do it. And the students and what have you, and we had students from Luton, you name it, Birmingham, everywhere. And of course with Birmingham Six campaigns even up here in Glasgow.
In 1991, the Six had their third and final appeal. They won.
There were 6 men in Birmingham and Guildford, there's 4 that were picked up and tortured and framed by the law. And the film got promotion, but they're still doing time for being Irish in the wrong place and at the wrong time. In Ireland they'll put you away in the maze. In England they'll keep you for 7 days. God help you if ever you can on these shores. The coppers need someone and they walk through that door. You'll be counting years.
What we achieved post Birmingham and Guildford was the Criminal Cases Review Board. What we achieved then was a re-examination of the evidence of a very large number of cases, and as a result of that, quite a lot of people have come out. Also, that helped with the development of PACE, Police and Criminal Evidence Act, which means there's a much better form of taking evidence, and the European Court of Human Rights ruling that confessions cannot be a basis for prosecution or conviction. There has to be something, some evidence to back things up, because remember, all the Birmingham and Guildford people all confessed to offences they could not have committed.
A year after their release, they got hold of some of the notebooks the police had written their false confessions on.
If they'd have made up their notes as they claimed, they would have made their notes up in 1974. And when we got the notebooks, it was found that the actual date of West Midlands Police getting the notebooks, they were not issued to the West Midlands Police Force until the 22nd of February 1975, 3 months later. They went to court in London and were remanded on bail, and this went on for about 18 months. And after about the 5th or 6th court appearance, I can't remember which one it was, a new magistrate came in one day from outside London. And of course when he came in and he made a ruling that they wouldn't get a fair hearing because of adverse publicity. Because everybody in the country knew that we'd been believed that we'd been tortured and framed. So therefore they couldn't get a fair trial, and he struck it out. That was on the Wednesday or Thursday of the week. The following Monday, the DPP, who was then a woman, Barbara Mills, went to the house and told the house that she put a 75-year ruling on the Birmingham pub bombing and Guildford papers, a public interest immunity grant for 75 years, and that there'd be no more investigations. And that was it.
Why do you think they've done that?
Because they don't want the truth to come out. If the truth did come out, it would show that members of the 1974 Labour government, the judiciary and the police forces were complicit in the torture and framing of innocent people. And we know that is in the files.
In relation to Northern Ireland, the entire British state was steeped in corruption, and not a single person has been held accountable for that. Not a single British official has been brought to court or has even been disgraced and sacked. Not one.
Lord Denning said it would have been better if they hung us, even though we were innocent. But he said it was better to hang innocent people than to bring the system into disrepute. And yet these are the same that have the audacity to talk about justice, fairness, honesty, truth. They're rotten. Rotten, and the higher up the ladder you go, the more rotten and corrupt and evil they are.
When he got out of jail, Paddy threw himself into campaigning for other miscarriage of justice victims. In later years, he'd set up the Miscarriages of Justice organisation, an organisation that helps innocent people both in prison and after their release.
If you'd have told me the day I got out of prison that I wouldn't be able to handle the outside world, I'd have told you to go and yourself. After what I've been through, I've been living in a war zone. I've been living in a cell smaller than this room for 16 and a half years, surrounded with nothing but hate and anger and violence and bitterness and what have you. Living on my nerves 24/7, and of course you don't realise it, that you've changed, and you come out and then within a short period of time you find that the outside world has got all in common with you. You don't want to be here. You want to go back to jail. My mother was diagnosed in February of '92 with breast cancer. And of course I took time out for her. And it was only then that I started breaking down. And of course you become very estranged, because I had 6 kids when I went away. And when I come out I had grandchildren, and I hardly ever see them. And it's no fault of theirs. The fault lies with me, because I don't feel nothing for my kids. And I had to tell them that. I told them that in '92. I don't feel nothing for them. Dead inside. You know, you're on a high, because I lived in London then. And I used to be on a high coming up to see them. But within a half an hour of being in their company, it's like little men in here screaming, "Get out of here, get out of here." You had to get out. And I used to go out and leave them, and then I sit there in the car and break down and cry, because I just didn't feel nothing for them. I'd rather be in the company of strangers.
20 years after his release, Paddy still suffers breakdowns, and he's haunted by his past, both day and night.
I have this video in my head of walking into Queen's Road police station in Birmingham, like Arnie Schwarzenegger or something with a big machine gun and shooting every. And if I could get all the cops involved in my case, I'd quite happily do it. Get them all in one room, I could quite happily go in and shoot every one of them.
One of the country's leading psychologists has told him that he has the most severe case of post-traumatic stress disorder he's ever seen. But just like he had to fight for his freedom, he's been forced to campaign for the psychological help he now needs.
There's organisations that are set up by the government to help prisoners. But when I've been to them and I have letters off them, I make them put in writing. They'd love to help me, but unfortunately the money they get from the government can only be used for the resettlement and the rehabilitation of guilty offenders. And because we're innocent, they can't help us. This is a battle that you'd always find. The British establishment has the hardest of problems admitting to their wrongdoing. They would rather spend millions in covering it up and pretending it never happened. And that's just the way the system is. It's always been like that, and it probably always will be.
After over a decade of campaigning, in April 2011, Paddy was granted a month's treatment at the Caprio Nightingale Hospital in London.
I'm not the most intelligent bloke in the world, but I'm certainly far from being the stupidest. And I just can't get my head around how nearly 40 years of trauma, etc., how they're going to do something in 20 days, 28 days.
Paddy Hill's a man who is still, of course, deeply affected by the experience that he had, and he'll admit himself, you know, that Paddy's never going to entirely recover from what had been done to him. So although he was released after 16 years from his life sentence, to some extent he's still serving. There is a life sentence there. He'll never recover from it. And it's a scandal that he had to campaign again to get the help that he needed, the medical help that he needed to deal with that trauma. You know, sort of, Britain's very, of course, Britain's got what? Hundreds of years of experience of dealing with colonial situations, and they've perfected all the techniques, and they rarely admit that they're wrong. People, sort of veterans of the campaign in Kenya for independence by the Land and Freedom Army, the so-called Mau Mau. Even now, 50 years later, there's people having to go to court to have it acknowledged that they were imprisoned wrongly, that they were tortured, that their friends and families were killed in Kenya. All these years later, they still won't admit it.
There were 6 men in Birmingham and Guildford, there's 4 that were picked up and tortured and framed by the law. And the folk got promotion, but they're still doing time for being Irish in the wrong place and at the wrong time. In Ireland, they'll put you away in the maze. In England, they'll keep you for 7 days. God help you if ever you caught on these shores. The coppers need someone and they walk through that door. You'll be counting years, first 5 and 10, growing old in a lonely hell, round the yard in the state.
In 1974, IRA bombs exploded in 2 crowded Birmingham pubs. 21 people were killed in the most devastating terrorist attack yet on the British mainland. Within 3 hours, 5 men had been detained by the West Midlands crime squad. The next day, another suspect was arrested. They became known as the Birmingham Six.
And I noticed out of the corner of my eye, the bloke standing outside the door. And there's a cop standing there. And he's got 2 .38s. He's got one round his waist. And he's got a shoulder holster. And I remember looking, I'm thinking the same thing now, even as I'm talking to you. When I looked at him, I was thinking to myself, fuck me, some poor bastard's in for a rough ride. And I never dreamed for 1 second it had anything to do with me.
Although they claimed their confessions were beaten out of them, the 6 men were convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment.
We didn't go for trial to be tried, we just went to be sentenced.
The Guildford Four, doing life for another IRA bombing the same year, also protested their innocence. But for 10 years their pleas were rejected until new evidence came to light.
No, I'll not return to see more sorrow.
The campaign for the release of the Birmingham Six and Guildford Four was building up, and you know, people wanted us to go and do benefit shows, and I just thought the right way probably to go about it would be, in fact, if I could get Shane to write a song about it.
It's not meant to be a happy song, you know. You're meant to feel bad enough to fucking do something, you know.
Terry Woods came up with that lament at the beginning, that Streets of Sorrow thing, which is kind of part of the song, really.
So farewell, you streets of sorrow.
And it just comes pounding into this, into the actual Birmingham Six, which is like, just anger really just comes welling up.
There was a shooting bomb, Guildford is fire up and tortured and framed by the law. Folk got promotion, still don't sign. When Irish in the wrong place and at the wrong time.
I thought it was a joke at first when I heard about it, that McGann was going to do a song.